Picture a finance minister from a small African or Southeast Asian country landing in Beijing one week and Washington the next, walking into polished conference rooms in both capitals with the very same proposal in his briefcase: a new port, a 5G network, a power plant, and listening carefully as two rival superpowers make competing offers. For most of the 20th century, countries like his were treated as passive arenas where big powers fought for influence. They were expected to choose a camp, salute the flag, and accept whatever deal their sponsor offered. But something very different is happening now. As the rivalry between the United States and China intensifies, many governments in the global South have quietly discovered that they no longer hold a begging bowl. They sit in something closer to an auction house. Instead of pleading with one donor, they invite several bidders into the room and ask a simple question: who will give us better terms? This is a hidden playbook behind today's geopolitics, and it's one Western audiences often miss. We still talk as if countries are either pro-China or pro-America. In reality, the smartest ones are mostly pro-themselves, learning to turn U.S.-China competition into leverage. To see how revolutionary this is, we have to remember where these countries started. During the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, much of Asia, Africa, and Latin America existed as a string of client states. Aid, weapons, and trade came with clear political strings. You were either in Washington's camp or Moscow's camp. If a leader leaned the wrong way, there were coups, embargoes, or worse. Some governments tried to stay neutral, the so-called non-aligned movement, but they had little financial muscle. Then the Soviet Union collapsed, and for about 2 decades the world lived under what many call the unipolar moment. Western institutions like the IMF and World Bank dominated development finance. If you needed a loan, you went to Washington or Brussels and accepted what became known as the Washington Consensus. Open your markets, privatize state firms, cut subsidies, and hope growth followed. For many countries, there was no real alternative. That is the first big shift we tend to forget. The second is China's rise. As China joined the World Trade Organization, built up massive foreign exchange reserves, and launched the Belt and Road Initiative, it did something the Soviet Union never managed. It became a credible, deep-pocketed economic partner for the global South. It offered roads, ports, and power plants, often built quickly and without long lectures about human rights or governance. Suddenly, for the first time in modern history, many developing countries had not one, but 2 major sources of capital and technology. At the same time, the United States and its allies began to respond, launching their own infrastructure plans and talking about high-quality or values-based investments. This created conditions for what we can call bidding war diplomacy, instead of going hand-in-hand to a single patron. Leaders in Nairobi, Jakarta, or Brasilia realized they could quietly play Washington and Beijing off against each other. They could ask China to finance a railway, then use the prospect of that deal to push the World Bank or Japan to improve their own offers. Or they can invite a Western consortium to build a digital network, then use that as leverage to negotiate better terms from Huawei. From begging bowl to auction house, that's the structural change few in the West fully appreciate. To understand what this new bidding game looks like, we need to look at the currencies it trades in: concrete, code, and credit, infrastructure, technology, and finance. On infrastructure, China's Belt and Road Initiative has been the headline act. Since the early 2010s, it has pledged hundreds of billions of dollars for ports, highways, power plants, and railways stretching from Pakistan's Gwadar and Sri Lanka's Hambantota to Kenya's Mombasa and Ethiopia's Addis Ababa Railway. These projects are often built fast. Chinese state-owned companies can mobilize labor and materials at a scale Western firms struggle to match. For governments desperate to show something tangible to their voters, a new bridge, a modern port, that speed matters. But Chinese money is rarely free. It comes as loans, not grants, and those loans must be repaid in dollars or yuan. Western actors, startled by how quickly Beijing moved, are now trying to catch up. The G7 has announced its own initiatives, different acronyms in different years, promising clean and transparent infrastructure. The European Union talks about its global gateway strategy, and the U.S. has financed selected projects through its Development Finance Corporation. These efforts are still smaller than Belt and Road, but they exist, and they give recipient countries something they have not had before: choice. On technology, the bidding war is just as fierce. When a country decides to build a 5G network, it often faces a stark menu. On one side are Chinese vendors like Huawei and ZTE, which offer integrated solutions that can be cheaper and deployed quickly. On the other are European and U.S.-aligned firms like Nokia, Ericsson, and various American partners, usually with higher prices and more conditions. The U.S. leans on allies to avoid Chinese equipment, citing security concerns and the risk of espionage. China reminds partners of its track record in building networks across the global south. Many governments try to split the difference, using Western vendors in sensitive government systems, Huawei in more commercial or rural networks, and delaying final decisions as long as possible to see who sweetens the deal. Finance is a third currency. The U.S. still dominates the dollar system, which means its sanctions and banking rules have global reach. If you anger Washington badly enough, you can find your banks cut off from SWIFT and your reserves frozen, as Iran, Venezuela, and more recently Russia discovered. That pushes sanctioned or vulnerable countries to seek lifelines from China, which can offer currency swaps, direct loans from its state banks, or inclusion in alternative payment systems. Yet those alternatives are not full replacements. China's financial markets are less open and trusted than America's. Most governments, therefore, try to stay on good terms with both camps, extracting credit and investment from each while avoiding being fully locked into either. This is where the strategy of multi-alignment comes in. During the old Cold War, being non-aligned often meant being weak, isolated, or punished by both sides. Today, a number of mid-sized powers are practicing something more agile. They align with multiple great powers at once and constantly rebalance. India is a clear example. It is a member of the Quad, a security dialogue with the U.S., Japan, and Australia that many see as a hedge against China. It conducts military exercises with American forces and buys U.S. equipment. At the same time, India is part of BRICS with China and Russia, buys discounted Russian oil, and maintains deep trade ties with Beijing even despite border tensions. When pressured to join Western sanctions on Moscow, New Delhi simply refused, knowing that both Washington and Moscow still need it. In the Gulf, Saudi Arabia and other monarchies long relied on the U.S. security umbrella, denominating oil in dollars and hosting American bases. Today, they are courting Chinese investment, selling more energy to Asia, and even discussing the idea, still limited but symbolically important, of some oil sales price in yuan. They host visits from Xi Jinping and Joe Biden almost back-to-back. In Southeast Asia, countries like Vietnam and Indonesia welcome Chinese factories and tourists while quietly strengthening military ties with the U.S. and buying weapons from Russia or Europe. Their official line is always the same: we do not want to choose sides. We want strategic autonomy. Multi-alignment is not confusion. It is a deliberate strategy to keep options open and to force big powers to compete for favor. Behind these high-level maneuvers are everyday lives. When a government successfully turns rivalry into a bidding war, the results can be tangible for ordinary people. A new Chinese-built railway can cut a farmer's travel time to market from 2 days to 6 hours. A Western-funded solar farm can bring electricity to villages that relied on diesel generators. Jobs are created in construction, logistics, and services. Students get scholarships to study in Beijing, New York, or Berlin. For many citizens, the geopolitical game is not abstract. It shows up as an asphalt road, a smartphone tower, or a new industrial zone. But there are darker sides. Debt has become a flashpoint. When projects fail to generate the revenue expected, governments struggle to service loans, whether they come from Chinese banks or Western lenders. Critics talk of debt-trap diplomacy on one side and austerity conditionality on the other, but the underlying problem is the same: ambitious infrastructure built on shaky economic assumptions. When repayments become too heavy, ordinary people often pay the price through budget cuts, currency devaluations, or higher taxes. There's also the issue of imported surveillance tools. Both Western and Chinese companies sell facial recognition systems, data mining software, and internet monitoring technologies. Authoritarian-leaning leaders can use these to track opponents and shrink civic space, regardless of which flag is on the box. The bidding war, in other words, is not automatically a path to freedom. It can just as easily finance new ways to control populations. All of this adds up to a central paradox we might call choice without capacity. Having multiple bidders gives governments in the global South more room to maneuver. But if their institutions are weak, if parliaments are sidelined, media is muzzled, and corruption is high, then that extra choice can end up enriching a small elite rather than building broad-based prosperity. A minister can sign opaque deals with whichever partner offers the biggest personal payoff, not the best project of the country. In such cases, bidding war diplomacy risks turning into a shell game where the logos on construction equipment change, but the underlying dependency does not. So where does this new game lead? On one path, the global South gradually converts competition into real strategic autonomy. By diversifying partners, insisting on transparency, and strengthening domestic institutions, countries could secure better financing terms, transfer real technology, and avoid over-reliance on any single great power. Regional organizations, the African Union, ASEAN, Mercosur, the Gulf Cooperation Council, could coordinate positions so that big powers negotiate with them as blocs rather than picking them off one by one. On another path, however, rivalry hardens into coercion. As the U.S. and China view each other more as existential threats, their tolerance for multi-alignment may shrink. They may start demanding clearer loyalty, punishing those who flirt too openly with the other camp through sanctions, cyber tax, or withdrawn investment. In such a world, today's auction house could turn back into an arena, not of open bidding, but of pressure and fear. Much depends on how leaders in both great powers and small states choose to play the next few decades. What is clear already is that the old image of a helpless global South is out of date. From African capitals to Southeast Asian ports, savvy governments have learned that in a world of rival giants, the smartest strategy is not to pick a permanent side, but to pick terms, timing, and partners with care. That gives them leverage they never had before, but also responsibilities they cannot escape. Because in this new great power contest, the real winners will not be the countries that shout the loudest slogans about China or America. They will be the ones that use bidding war diplomacy and multi-alignment, not just a change whose flag flies over a project, but a change who truly benefits from at home. In other words, in a world where superpowers compete for influence, the most powerful move for the global South is not to choose sides. It is to choose a deal that finally puts their own people first.